Hey everybody, welcome back to Chronic Woodwork. I'm Andy and today is episode 9 in my series of videos on how to build a cedar strip canoe. Today we are going to prep, flip, and epoxy and fiberglass the inside of the hull of my cedar strip canoe. Ready? Let's get it. Preparation for flipping the canoe began with building cradles. These are two small stands that kind of serve as hammocks for the canoe to sit in, that way you can work on the interior of the hull. Canoe craft calls for these cradles to be about 26 inches tall. As you'll see moving forward in my video, I would recommend that they be taller. I'm about 6 foot even, so you do the math with what works for you and what's comfortable. Building a cedar strip canoe is not a cheap endeavor, so I went down to the box store and just bought some simple 2x4s and slapped these together with some glue and the drywall screws that I had left over from building my strong back in episode 1. I checked them for strength and they work just fine. Canoe Craft also recommends using clean carpet scraps. I didn't feel like buying any carpet scraps, so I just used a towel we had laying around the house, cut it up, and made sure it fit. I sat the two cradles side by side to make sure my towels were hanging at the same depth, and then I secured them with some blocks that I drove a couple of screws into. The last thing I wanted to happen was to sit the canoe right side up on these cradles and then have the cloth give way. I sat these to the side and went down to the basement to start preparing to flip the canoe. I didn't know exactly what shape the inside of the hull was going to be in, if the forms were going to be epoxied or glued somehow to the canoe itself, so I removed all the drywall screws attaching the forms to the strong back. At this point, we were ready to flip. You'll see me covering the canoe cradles with some plastic. I just didn't want any of the pink fuzz from the towel to get onto the canoe, so I just covered it up. It's probably unnecessary. But finally, we flipped this thing over, and it is a pretty monumental step, even though no actual work is being done to the canoe. Trust me, you'll feel accomplished. Cleaning up the interior of the hull began with the stems. You lose sight of the stems really early on when you're planking the hull, and I realized that they were still very blocky and square on the inside. I did my best to get a chisel in there and soften these edges just to make them a little bit more aesthetically appealing. After cleaning up the stems, I started to sand. Let me say it once just to cover my butt. Make sure you're wearing some kind of respirator when you're sanding. The purpose of this first round of sanding was just to reveal any flaws in the cedar strips, if any of those bead or coves were going to give way. So I made a rough pass with 60 grit to reveal these trouble areas, and then I filled those trouble areas with West Systems epoxy and some fine cedar dust to help hide those imperfections. I masked off the area I didn't want to get epoxy onto with blue painter's tape and then filled the voids with the epoxy mix. After filling all the voids, I made sure to pull the blue painter's tape. I didn't want the epoxy to dry on the blue painter's tape because it'd be very, very difficult to remove. While the epoxy was drying, I decided to take care of a couple of other trouble areas. As you start to move up the sides of the hull, the sander's just not going to be able to reach, so I took a chisel and knocked off any major glue drips. On the outside of the hull, I was able to wipe these drips away, but because these were on the interior, you just couldn't catch them all. At this point, I just had to wait for the epoxy along the keel line to dry. And Dixie says hi. After a day or two, I came back and it was right back to sanding. I started with 60 grit and worked my way down to 120, wetting the hull of the canoe down between each pass. I started very aggressively down towards the bottom where I had the epoxy to sand off, but that portion went pretty quickly. The major challenge was the interior curve of the hull. At some point, the sander's just not going to be able to reach, so I converted to hand sanding. I went back to 80 grit just to knock down some stuff more quickly, but I don't have a better fix to tell you guys than you just have to get after it. I had the best luck with one of those foam sanding pads that you can attach Velcro sanding pads to. That worked best for me, but as you'll see, I also wrapped a water bottle in some sandpaper, and that worked okay. That was one of the tips and tricks from Canoe Craft and also from my buddy Trent over at Pressler Woodshop. Sanding by hand doesn't allow you to easily use a vacuum, so you'll see I'm still wearing my mask, and I'm using a broom to help sweep up the vast majority of the dust. I'm telling you guys, it is a lot of sanding. I know it doesn't make the best video, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't show you a significant amount of sanding. When I was satisfied, I wet down the interior of the hull for the final time. Before getting the fiberglass sheet out, I let the captain of the ship have a seat and inspect my work. She was pleased. But then it was back to work, and it was time to lay out the fiberglass sheet and lay the epoxy. I was really nervous, and this time it was just my wife and I, so not the best footage again. My focus was on wetting out the sheet, so the video was secondary, and I apologize for that. I'll discuss my major takeaways at the end of the video, but you'll see one of them here where my wife and I kick the canoe cradle in towards the middle of the canoe. This is just to help stabilize it a bit. We had a lot of rock, which I'm sure you're seeing in the video, and it was just super frustrating when we were trying to fiberglass and epoxy. I'm going to post a link in the description below to the Bear Mountain Boats video for how to glass the interior of your canoe, and that is a really good explanation if you're interested. For the first coat of epoxy going into the fiberglass sheet, I strongly recommend using a brush. You want to just soak the sheet as much as you can, ensure you get 100% saturation, and then come back afterwards about 20 to 30 minutes later and squeegee it out into a fine, even coat. After the first coat was in, I took a little nap and came back 3 hours later to check in and do the second coat. I began by checking for spots that looked like they weren't saturated or kind of appeared dry, and that was where we first attacked. So we used a variety of tools, from the foam roller to a paintbrush and then straight into the squeegee. Finally, we waited 3 more hours and applied a third coat and called it good. At this point, I also snipped away any of the excess fiberglass sheet hanging off the top. Hey everybody, that's just about going to do it for this episode of how to build a cedar strip canoe. Before I go, as always, I want to give away my big takeaways from this round of the build. Obviously, it's only my second time using fiberglass and epoxy, and my big takeaways were this. One, it was just my wife and I working. If you can, get more hands to help you out. And the reason I say that is because as we were working from one end of the canoe to the other, by the time I got back to where we started to start squeegeeing out some of these lumps and bumps, it had already started to harden and cure, and I still have some bumps left over. The second part of that being is that these Bondo squeegees that I got from the big box store are not very good. I'm not trying to trash the product, but for this application, they're not great. I haven't used anything else, so I don't want to give any advice firsthand. Just try and avoid these if you can. Find something that's a little bit more pliable. And then finally is to lift and stabilize the canoe. So it's not too bad for sanding. As you can see, I'm sitting. I could easily reach in and sand, but when it comes to laying the epoxy into the fiberglass sheet, it is a major pain in the back, literally. So those are my big 3 takeaways. I hope they help you along the way. See you next time. Thanks.